So today I want to talk about decision making, and I particularly want to talk about decision making in a fast changing world. And there's no question that our world is changing faster than ever before. We all know that. But how do you take advantage of that, and how do you make better decisions as a result of this fast changing world? Because what you might find is that what you thought you used to know and the way that you used to make decisions and your expertise and your experience from the past may not serve you as well in the future. So I want to talk about some of the things that are coming up around the corner, and it might help you with your decision making. So first of all, I'm going to run a poll. So the question I'd like to ask you is, when you think about the next 3 years, where will your biggest competition come from? And I'm going to run this as a poll, so I'm only going to give you 4 options to choose from. So let me launch the poll. For people who have never done one of these online polls before, all you've got to do is pick one of the options. It should be coming up on your screen right now, and just tick one of the boxes. So I'm giving you 4 options here. In the next 3 years, looking ahead at your business, do you think that your biggest competition is going to come from your existing competitors, who you know, the people that you're competing head to head with, existing companies from outside your industry, so you know that there's somebody who may be eyeing the industry? Is it going to be startup companies, so companies that don't exist yet but are coming up in the industry? Or is it going to be startup companies outside the industry? Outside your industry, whatever that happens to be. So I can see here we've got about half the people have voted, so I'll give it another few seconds and then I'll close the polls and I'll show the results, and I'll also show you some results from Accenture when they did this. They did some similar research surveying Australian leaders, so CEOs and senior managers, when they asked them this exact same question, and we'll see what they said. Okay, I've got 90% of people have voted, so let me close the poll now, and we'll look at the results. Okay, so let me share the results here. Okay, so most people, still the majority of people, think that the biggest competition they're going to face in the next 3 or so years is going to come from existing companies in your own industry. So 44%, so almost half the people here on this webinar, and about 1/3 are the exact opposite extreme, which is saying that the competition is going to come from companies that don't even exist yet and from an industry that's outside your own. Okay, so thank you for taking part in that poll. Let me show you what Accenture said when what they found in their research. So they published this report a couple of years ago, and they asked CEOs this exact same question: where do you think your biggest threats are going to be in the next few years? And exactly those same 4 options that I shared with you. And what they said was, so about 1/3 said that the competition is going to come from people we already know, that we're competing head to head with, about 1/4 from outside the industry, but existing companies. About 1/4 said startup companies in the industry, and very few said startup companies outside the industry. So it's a little bit of a different spread than this webinar audience, but that's not surprising. But I think the interesting thing about this is that if you look at this first column, so 30% of people are saying that their existing competitors are going to be their biggest threat. But if you look at everybody else, what we're looking at here is 70% of people say that their biggest threats are going to come from people who aren't their current competitors. And a generation ago, I'm sure these results would have been quite different. It probably would have been 70-30 in the other direction. Because a generation ago, the threats were coming from people you already knew about. So you'd be forging ahead, but you'd have one eye looking over your shoulder to see what your competitors are doing. And that would probably be enough for you to mitigate most of those risks. But that's no longer the case. It's no longer the case that you can just rely on looking at what your competitors are doing and just staying one step ahead of them. You've got to have other ways of making smart decisions about your future. So how do you do that? What are the tools that you use in decision making? Now, Chip and Dan Heath wrote this book a few years ago where they did some research. They did extensive research in what are the things that successful decision making, what are the factors behind successful decision making? So I'm going to ask you. So they came up with 4 things that they said would help people make better decisions. And I've shared this in a couple of webinars recently. So you might have seen this, but I'm going to do the question again for you. How can you improve your decision? So let's say you're facing a decision that you're about to make for your business. So here in Australia right now, when I'm recording this, we're getting close to the end of the Australian financial year. And you may be making decisions about what you're going to do in your business or your professional life in the next financial year. And you might have a decision about, are you going to launch something? Are you going to fail something? Are you going to partner with somebody? And I want to know, what sort of factors do you take into account when making your decisions? So, and then I'm going to share with you what the 4 factors that the Heath brothers identified. So, for example, one of the things you might say is, when I have a difficult decision to make, one of the things I do is I sleep on it. Another thing you might say is I make a list of pros and cons. Okay, so they're the sort of answers that I'm looking for. By the way, those were not among the 4 that the Heath brothers identified as making better decisions. So I can ask you, please, if you can, in the question box, if you can type in, what do you think? What do you do when you make decisions? What are the sort of things that you do when you make decisions? So I'll just give you the chance to do that now, and I'll read them out. I'll keep this anonymous, but please just give me some of the answers that you use. Okay, so test as soon as possible. Go for a walk. Get more data. Discuss with trusted advisors, both inside and outside the industry. Consult others. Identify different options. Yeah, pros and cons, that did come up. Yep, even though it wasn't one of the 4, as I've already said. It did come up. Great, interesting. Use facts. Get data and then stress out and then decide. Okay, interesting. So let me share with you the results of the Heath brothers' research. These are the 4 things that they identified. Number 1, and this has come up already, get more data. So widen your options. Actually give yourself more options to choose from. So rather than limiting your options, how do you get more options? And that's definitely one of the things that we've got now. We've got many more options, but there's a trap with that, which I'll get to shortly. The second one is to test your assumptions. So are you making assumptions that are limiting the decisions or the quality of your decisions? The next one's get more distance. And this one doesn't mean sleep on it, so you give yourself a bit more time. It means looking ahead to the future. So you might ask yourself, if I make this decision, what impact will it have 10 days from now, 10 weeks from now, and 10 years from now? And giving yourself that distance and that perspective might help you make a better decision, because it's too easy to be influenced too much by the short-term outcomes and forget about what happens in the long term. And the last one is make sure you've got plan B, C, and D so that you can be prepared to be wrong. So don't stick stubbornly to a decision just because you made it in the face of conflicting evidence. So this skill of foresight is essential when you're making decisions in the future. And foresight means looking ahead to the future and using that to influence your decisions. And I reckon if you're going to act with foresight, there are 3 things you're going to do. So you're going to scan wider, which is to look at, as I said, you want to look wider to widen your options, and then narrow down. So this is where you actually do the decision making. And then you take action. You go deep after you made decisions, and after you made those decisions, of course, you test your assumptions, and you be willing to be wrong, and switch to something else. Today, I want to focus on this area here of narrowing down. So when we look at these 4 options, the one that most people don't do well enough is this first one. They don't widen their options. They don't give themselves enough options to start with, which means that you've got to hope that you're lucky that you've picked within your range of options, you picked one that's actually going to be effective for you, whereas it actually is much more likely that you've missed some other options that might have been even better, but because you didn't even consider them, they never came across your radar. We're not going to talk a lot about widening options here because I want to talk about more the decision-making process, but I do want to point out one trap with having a lot of options, and that is when you have more options, you can sometimes be spoiled for choice, and it prevents you from making a decision. And I reckon if I asked you, have you ever been in the situation where you've had so many options that you just don't choose at all? And you'd rather that somebody just said to you, look, would you rather have A or B instead of A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way up to Z? And people do get spoiled for choice. Sheena Iyengar, who's a professor at Columbia University, she did some really interesting experiments around this, and she's written this book, The Art of Choosing. And probably her most famous experiment in this area was where she set up a kiosk in a shopping mall, and she had jam jars. So she was selling jam. And there are two versions of the experiment. In one version, she had the kiosk was set up with six different varieties of jam. So this was version one. And the second version, she had 24 varieties of jam. And she was just looking at when shoppers came along and how many would stop and look and how many would buy. And what she found was when they had more variety, more people were attracted to it and they came along and looked. But fewer people bought. When she only gave them 6 choices, they were much more likely to buy. And when you think about it, that's a bit odd. It's a bit bizarre because the 6 choices were also available when she had another 18 available, when she had the 24. But because people were so overwhelmed by that, they just decided not to make a decision at all. In fact, they made the decision not to make a decision. So, which is a bit odd because they still had those 6 to choose from, but they were overwhelmed by that. So just be careful when you widen your options. Sometimes it can stymie you, and part of decision making is choosing between some widen options, but then choose between them in an intelligent way, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise with you later. So I want to present something about what's coming up around the corner. And I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise with you later. And to do this exercise, I need a little bit of input from you. So what I'd like you to do is think about what are the biggest assets in your business. And I'm going to ask you to share them, but don't share them here in the question box. What I'd like you to do is go to askgihan.com and share them there, because that way we'll be able to see the results from everybody. So let me show you what that's going to look like. So if you go to askgihan.com right now, you'll see this. It's like this public bulletin board, and you just click the little button in the corner to add. And all I'd like you to do, don't write your name or your business or anything, but just in this title area, what are the biggest assets in your business? And let's do them one at a time. So, for example, you might have great staff as an asset in your business. You might have strong client database. Okay, so that's what I'd like you to do. And I'm going to just leave this open for a bit for you to write some others. Yeah, client base, good. Loyal client base, good. And we'll come back to this later. But if I'll just give you the chance now to seed this, because that'll help. And if you've got more than one, can you put them in a separate note? Because you can do as many as you like here. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, good. That's enough for us to work with for the moment. Please feel free to keep adding, because we'll come back to this later. And I was keen to keep this anonymous because we're going to come back later and then see how we can disrupt some of these assets in your business. All right, let me come back to that later. So let me share with you some research from the Future Today Institute. And what they looked at the start of the year was some tech trends. So they've specifically looked at the future only around technology. And obviously there are a whole bunch of other things that are happening which are not technology related, but there's plenty within technology itself that we can use to consider for our decision making for the next year. And what they did was you can download the report, by the way, and it's easy to find. Just Google this and you can get it from the Future Today Institute. And what they did was they looked at a number of technologies that are coming up in our future, some of them are already here, And they classified them in two categories. So one is they said, how likely is this to happen? How certain are we that this technology is going to become reality? So was it low or high? And then the other axis that they used, the other scale, was, is this going to happen soon? So it's going to have an immediate impact, or will it have a long-term impact? And based on those, so they looked at all the technology that's coming up around the corner that people are talking about, and they classified it according to these two categories. And that means that we now have 4 of them. So they said if it's uncertain, so it's a low certainty, and it may only have a long-term impact, well, we're safe to ignore it for the moment. So we can revisit it later. So because even if it happens, it's going to have a long-term impact, and we're not even sure it's going to happen. On the other hand, if it's likely, so there's a high certainty, but it's not going to have much of an immediate impact, then we should think about it, but think about it strategically as maybe something we can keep in mind. It's going to inform our strategy, but not necessarily mean that we need to take action at the moment. The next one is, what if it's the other way around? What if it's something that could have an immediate impact, but it's pretty uncertain. We're not really sure whether it's going to happen, but if it does, it'll have an immediate impact. Well, those are the sort of things that we need to stay vigilant about. We need to keep an eye on them. So, for example, I think that blockchain falls into this category, that I think if it turns out to have a real impact, it'll happen really fast. But at the moment, there's a lot of hype about it. There are a lot of people talking about it, but there aren't really many case studies or real life implementations of true blockchain. So I think it's low certainty, and we should keep an eye on it. We should stay vigilant about it, but we don't need to take any action now. The kind that we do need to take action on are these things up here, which have high certainty, they're very likely to happen, and they're going to have an immediate impact. So if you read the report, there's quite a lot that fall into that category. Not all of them. I reckon there's a pretty reasonable spread among all 4 categories, so they haven't tried to say that everything is going to have an impact straight away. What I'm going to do now is share just 9 of the things that they identified which fall into this category here, this quadrant here. It's likely to happen, and it's going to have an immediate impact. So let me share those 9 with you, and then we'll go back to those biggest assets in your business, and we'll have a look what if any one of them did affect one of those biggest assets. So let me share the 9 quickly first. It won't take very long, and then we'll do a little bit of an analysis with what you shared earlier. Okay, so one of them is artificial intelligence. You've probably heard a lot about it. It's already having an impact, and it's only going to have a bigger impact. So this is computers and software acting intelligently in whatever way that means. The next one is video. So we're moving away from just text to video, and that's obviously happened in the last few years anyway, but it's going to have an even bigger impact in the near future. The idea of data. So who owns data? The data about you, that there are all these devices collecting data about you at the moment. Who owns it? How do you use it? How do you use it for analysis so you can get big data about people through Fitbits, through their smartphone use, through cameras, monitoring wherever you're going, all those sort of things. There's a whole bunch of data being collected, and how's that going to be used? 3D printing, which has been around for a bit, but it's really becoming common now. And you can imagine that as soon as it becomes mainstream in any industry, it can completely transform that industry, because you can actually, literally, people can print 3-dimensional objects from the comfort of their home rather than having to have stuff shipped to them or having stuff delivered to them. A voice is also really big. So this is Amazon's Alexa and the Google Home, the Google Voice Assistant, and of course we've had Siri for a while as well. So if you've got or use any of these devices, you know just how good voice is at the moment, and voice recognition and voice understanding, and that's only going to grow. The next one is this idea of the gig economy or the sharing economy, that it's like the end of ownership. So rather than owning a car, you might always use an Uber or a driverless car in the future. Instead of owning a house, you might always rent. Instead of owning a parking space, you might, or if you do own a parking space, which is not in use for most of the day because you've drive your car away, you might rent that out to somebody else. If you own some storage space in your house, you might rent that out to somebody else who needs storage space. So this whole idea that you don't need to own stuff anymore, it's all shared, and technology has enabled that. Wearables, things like Fitbits, smartwatches, little devices that will be constantly monitoring you. And we hope that they're going to be monitoring you for positive reasons, such as in the workplace, you might have pedometers and those kind of wearables that monitor workers as they're walking around the office, not to see whether they're slacking off, but to see where they're walking. And maybe you can, by analyzing that data, you can facilitate better like increased productivity and better collaboration. For example, in some hospitals and aged care facilities, they're doing this. So they're looking at where the staff are walking around so that they can track which are the longest trips that they're taking, and can they shorten those trips? Can they make them more efficient? Can they help collaboration because they're making these trips all the time? So wearables are enabling people to do that. And the idea that you can control things in your home with your smartphone, essentially, this is much bigger in the US than it is here in Australia at the moment, but it's one of those things that's growing. So can you control thermostats in your home and the aircon in your home? Can you turn on lighting remotely? Can you manage your security remotely? Can you have monitoring of things like baby cams and nanny cams and do all of that remotely? So again, that's a growing area. So my partner Nikki, she has her home security alarm monitored that way, so she knows when people enter the house and the alarm, when the alarm's enabled or disabled, which is quite handy at times because there are other people living in the house with her. And the last one is this idea of sustainability or energy and climate change. So people are now looking for sustainable solutions for businesses to offer, and to make sure the businesses are sustainable in offering the solutions to any problems that they offer. Okay, so I went through this pretty quickly, but here are the 9 again in summary. Let me just quickly stop and just check if anyone's got any questions about any of them. And then we'll do this little interesting exercise where we'll have a look at those assets that you identified earlier, and let's see whether we can be disruptors to those businesses with those assets and with this sort of technology, which, as I said, seems to be the sort of things which the Future Today Institute identifies as high impact and immediate impact and high certainty. So let me just check if there's any questions. Okay, I don't see any coming in. Okay, so here's what we're going to do as a little exercise here. So let's have a look. Let me go back to the askgihan.com page. Right, okay, so we've got a few things here. Excellent. Okay, so we've got a few things here. So here's how the exercise is going to work. So what I'm going to do is on my screen, I'm going to switch back to the list of those 9. So you'll be able to see all 9 of them on your screen. I'll also ask you to keep that askgihan.com page open on your web browser so that then you can see. And I might be switching back and forth between them. But let me go back to this one first. So you'll be able to see all these 9. Okay, I'll just make sure this is coming up here. Okay, so you can see those 9 here. Let me switch my web browser so I can see what the things that are on askgihan.com, and you can have a look at them as well. So for example, let me give you an example first. So you've got a wide skill base of staff here. So staff is one of those things that might be disrupted by, for example, the sharing economy or the gig economy. So you might have permanent staff or employees who have certain skills, but are those really the full skill set that you need for the future? And are you better off? So if you didn't have that wide skill base of staff, and here's another one, I said great staff, or you've got employees. If you didn't have that, what would you do? Would you choose and would you hire exactly the same staff that you've got now? Or would you go to the sharing economy and bring in people for projects as you need them to do gigs, individual gigs for individual projects, and you bring in highly specialized people. I'm not just talking about people that you bring in from Fiverr who can do little small $5 jobs. But what if you could bring in really highly specialized people who've got these skills? They could be based anywhere in the world, and you bring them in for a particular project. You build this little fluid team for the project. At the end of the project, they disband, and then you move on to the next project, and you might bring in different people. Okay, so that's one of those things where that asset has been great for you and continues to be great for you. But if you didn't have that asset, could you take advantage of one of these 9 areas here? Okay, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Let's have a look at some of the others. Actually, let me switch back to this one now. Okay, so a couple of people here said, in fact, I think I said strong client database, but someone else here said a loyal client base. So is there, and actually even me, so the person who said me is the biggest asset in your business. So if you've got a loyal client base, could it be that that loyal client base, as valuable as it is it holding you back from something else? So the question is, if you didn't have that loyal client base, would you choose that? Would that automatically be the best thing for your business, or would you go for something else? I can't think straight away of an example from that list of 9, but let's see. Would you use artificial intelligence in some way? Would you use... Okay, so here's an example. So if you didn't have that loyal client base, you'd be free to do whatever you liked, because let's say you didn't have any clients. So would you say that we'll start with 3D printing, for example? So you don't necessarily, and it's a sort of area where you say, because of my loyal client base, I've got a brand, I've got a reputation I need to protect. There might be people I upset if I go in a completely different direction, but maybe going in a completely different direction is what I should be doing. So would I be using artificial intelligence, for example, and my clients would be upset if they're speaking to an artificial intelligence instead of speaking to a real person? Now, that might actually be the case, that they're used to speaking to a real person, and that's part of the reputation that you've built. And if you put in some sort of artificial intelligence where they're interacting, say, online with text, or they ring up and then they're speaking to a robot rather than a real person, then those clients might be upset by that. But that might actually be a really good thing for you to do, to invest in the future. But you're not going to do it because you've got this loyal client base that you're trying to protect. Okay, let's have a look at some of the others. So, for example, where you said, somebody else said... yeah, common sense was one of the others that came up. One design fits all was another one that came up. So things like common sense and experience are things that you think are assets for you, and they probably are. But sometimes that common sense and that experience can be holding you back. It may be that you think that your experience means that you don't need big data, for example, because you understand your business, you understand your clients, you understand the way that people work and the way that people buy, and therefore you might choose not to invest in some analytics program that'll help you understand your customers and clients better, because you think there's nothing better than my human knowledge. But actually it might turn out that data and data analytics can be better. So the idea of a data scientist is one of the most desirable jobs at the moment, because people recognize that being able to analyze this data can sometimes give you more intelligence than humans can, simply because you're analyzing a whole bunch of different data points and you're putting machine power to work on it at a much more intense pace and at a much greater volume than computers, than humans can. Okay, so I hope you get the idea here. So all we're doing is we're looking at some of this technology, we're looking at some of the assets that you've got, and we're saying, well, what if those assets were actually liabilities rather than assets? And the question to ask yourself is, if I didn't have this asset, this resource, let me switch back to that. So if I didn't have good engagement with stakeholders, if I didn't have that, if I didn't have any stakeholder engagement, would I choose what I've got now? If I didn't have this network of contacts, is this the network of contacts that I would build? So if I could wave a magic wand and I could have the best network of contacts I could have, would I choose the one that I've got now? If I didn't have this innovative concept and I had to create any concept to solve this problem that I'm solving through this innovative concept, is this the one that I would choose? If I didn't have a loyal client base, what would I do differently? And would I even choose a client base that I've got? So that's a way of looking at it. So as a decision-making process, it's a little bit counterintuitive because most people think, now that I've got what I've got, what do I do with it? What do I do to get there from what I've already got? And that's right, because it's in some sense that's correct, because what you want to do is be practical about it. But from another sense, just be aware that people who don't have those assets, who don't have those resources, are coming at it without that. And they may be able to tap into some of this new technology and some of these other trends. And as we saw earlier, a lot of the competition you're going to have is not going to come from your direct competitors. And when you start looking at if your decision making is only based on where you are now and how do you take the next step, then basically what you're doing is you're comparing yourself just with the competition. So you need to break that. If you want to think about competition from outside the industry or from startups, either inside or outside, just realize that they don't have those assets, and sometimes that is an asset in itself. Okay, so as I said, if you'd like to get the Think Sharper report, then just complete the exit survey at the end of today's webinar. I know we didn't go into this in a lot of detail, but it's a really powerful exercise, and we only did about 5 minutes worth of it, but it's worth doing. So I'd recommend that as a follow-up, it's really worth getting that Future Today Institute report, and just as an exercise for yourself or with your team, do exactly what we did. Identify your best resources, the things that people think are assets in the business, and then look at how you could disrupt them using some of this technology that's around the corner. In other words, what's got immediate impact and is high certainty. And thank you everyone for coming along. If you've got any questions, please email me, gihan@gihanpereira.com. And if you're interested in me speaking at your conference or running workshops for your team around thinking like a futurist, then please get in touch as well, because I'd be very happy to talk to you about that. Thanks everyone, and bye for now.